Hello everybody, today we're going to be doing a video on unity and distinction, which is by me, not any other philosopher. First, unity, method, and why. Unity is one of the three coextensive transcendentals, along with the good and the true. This is something that you can find extensive writings about in Aquinas, in Scotus. Scotus has a particularly developed theory of the transcendentals, which he talks about, or which gets talked about by Allan B. Wolter in his book on the subject. Suarez touches on it. I think it might be his 7th disputation. I could be wrong about that, but I think it's somewhere in there. Next, unity is a primitive. It can't be defined, it can only be described. The primary description follows in 2 clauses. Unity is non-division within itself and division with everything else. If you really analyze this, you would realize that both of these presuppose some idea of unity, so they can't define it, but they give you an idea of what we're talking about. Non-division with itself, so I am not divided from myself, I am myself, and division with everything else. I am not the lamp which is sitting on my floor. The broad outlines of the first half of this video are taken from Allan B. Wolter's little summary of metaphysics. I'll have a link to that in the description. The reason I'm making the video is because someone asked me to make a video on unity and distinction, and it's one of my hobbies, so, I thought, why not? Part 1, on unity and distinction. Broad categories. First, we have physical, non-physical, but in the thing, and conceptual. Physical, unity is always composed of parts. Physical things are always in potency to being split into smaller parts. That's the first category. Second category is non-physical, but in the thing. These are sometimes composed of parts, sometimes not. This is non-physical things like the soul, like angels, and their knowledge, like God. And then we have conceptual, non-physical, not in the thing. These are things in your mind. You can have conceptual distinctions, but they are not existent in the thing. They're existent somewhere else in the world. That'll be explained more in a second. Okay, first, physical unity. There's 2 primary kinds of physical unity. One is substantial unity, one is accidental unity. Substantial unity is unity between different physical parts of a substance, such as between a hand and a foot of a person, or between the hydrogen and oxygen in a water molecule. These are just parts which make up one full thing. Just take any full thing which isn't artificial, all the parts of it form a substantial unity. Next, you have accidental unity. This is just unity that's less than substantial. It's subdivided into intrinsic and extrinsic accidental unity. Intrinsic accidental unity is naturally formed. Extrinsic is externally imposed. You'll see more what I'm talking about in a second. Okay, accidental unity subdivided. Intrinsic accidental unity is subdivided into physical inclination and moral inclination. These are the things which cause the unities. A physical inclination to accidental unity would be the dependence that certain kinds of accidents have upon others, such as the dependence of color on quantity. You can't have the color of a thing without having surface, or you can't have sound without having surface. You need something that vibrates, but yeah. Then moral inclination is something which is like the formation of natural societies, such as the family or a normal society. These are instances of things which are natural, like the family isn't something that was constructed by humans. It's something which is built into us. The same with society as a whole, though to a lesser extent. So these are moral inclinations that cause this kind of accidental unity of the family. Then we have extrinsic accidental unity. First, we have artificial unity. This is unity of an artificial construct, such as a car, a hammer, or pants. These are things which aren't substantially unified. They're essentially just a collection of parts which are thrown together, which all have their own unities. Then we have unity by aggregation. This is just a compilation of things of a similar kind, like a pile of rocks or a row of soldiers. And then we have a moral aggregation, which is like an artificial society for a certain goal, such as a religious order. Next, we have non-physical unity in the thing. There are 4 kinds. First, formal unity. This is complete. Things with the same definition. They're literally the same thing. My soul is identical with my soul. It has formal unity with itself. Next is unity of simplicity. These are the different formalities of a thing that have distinct definitions but do not form parts. So this is different aspects of a thing. My soul is one singular thing. It's not made up of parts, but it does have a will and an intellect. These are two distinct aspects of the same Okay, next we've got unity of essential metaphysical parts. This is unity among parts which are non-physical but constitute parts, such as that between passive potency and actuality. Angels have both passive potency and actuality. They have the potency to receive new pieces of knowledge, and they are also actual. So there is a unity there of things which are non-identical, which can change their relationship to each other, so they have to be parts. But it's essential. The angel has to have that potency to be an angel. And then next we have unity of accidental metaphysical parts. This would be unity among parts which are non-physical and accidental, such as the angelic mind and it having a specific piece of knowledge and act rather than in potency. Then we have conceptual unity. Pretty simple. Conceptual unity is just when the same thing is considered in the same relation to everything else other than itself. When you think of Bob twice, you don't change anything about your thoughts. That's conceptual unity. Then you have conceptual multiplicity, when the same thing is considered in different relations, such as being the subject or predicate of a sentence, or Bob being considered as a father or as a brother. This is when you think of the same thing but in different relations that it has to other objects, such as, for example, thinking of Donald Trump as a father, a son, or a husband, or an American. These are relations that are outside of Donald Trump. Next, we have our section on distinction. In general, distinction is a negation of one kind of unity or another, and it follows from some of the outlines of the grades of unity, but is much, much simpler. There are three questions which are important for every kind of distinction. A. Is it a distinction of composition? Is it a distinction where the members of the distinction will make up parts? Is it a distinction, or B, is it a distinction before or after the action of the mind? So this is just to say, is it distinct in the thing, or is it only distinct after I think about it? And then finally, is it separate before or after the action of the mind? So this would be an instance of whether, even if it's in the same thing, it's not separate, or it's not separable by anything other than a mind. I can think about the idea of the will and the intellect as separate things, but in reality, they're always connected. So the first two grades. First, indistinct. Simply not distinct at all. The same thing, same definition. There's no difference, not a distinction. Next, we have the formal distinction. This is between two formalities of the same thing, such as animality and rationality, or the will and the intellect. They are different aspects of one thing. They're not parts. So this is where the questions come in. A, they're not a distinction of composition. B, they are distinct prior to the action of the mind. They're actually distinct in the thing. But C, they're separate after the action of the mind. So you can think about them as separate things, but in reality, they're always in the same thing. They're always aspects of the same thing. Next, we have the next two grades, plus a bonus. Distinction of composition. All physical distinctions, some non-physical distinctions, and no conceptual distinctions. These are just distinctions which form parts. If having this distinction makes parts in the thing, then, well, it's a distinction of composition. All physical things have parts, like I said earlier, so all of them are distinctions of composition. Okay, and then let's look at the three kinds, or the three questions. It is a distinction of composition, obviously. It is a distinction prior to the action of the mind, and it's separate prior to the action of the mind. Their parts, they come apart. They are separate in reality. It doesn't even matter that they come apart, but like they are apart. Even if they exist in the same thing, they are different parts of that same thing. So they are separate in that sense. Next, we have the conceptual distinction. This is a distinction between different relations in a thing, such as the distinction between Bob as a father and Bob as a brother. This is not a distinction of composition because it's only in minds when they think about the thing. It's only distinct after the action of the mind because it exists in the mind, and it's only separate after the action of the mind because, again, it's in the mind. Yeah, you can, again, just think of like Donald Trump as a father, husband, or a brother. And then finally, this is just thrown in here for completeness, is the nominal distinction. This is just when you call the same thing by two different names. You could call Bob, you could call him Robert, no one cares. It's, yeah. Part two. I added a part 2 to this. So the first half was the general outline of a theory of unity and distinction. The second section is a disputation on the formal distinction. This is a famously disputed idea in the history of scholastic and Christian philosophy. Many Thomists have taken great exception to the formal distinction. Francisco Suarez took exception to the formal distinction, and even some Franciscans have. So I collected some of the most prevalent arguments here against it, and I'll have responses to them. So first, the formal distinction is most famously championed by Blessed John Duns Scotus. Though it did not strictly originate with him, you can find it in some earlier philosophers. It is incompetently attacked by Phaser, Suarez, and other incompetents. It appears that I repeated myself there. Suarez specifically has 3 arguments against it, which we'll look at, which he puts forward in his tract on distinction. And then finally, we just have the definition again, just so we remember. Formal distinction is a distinction between 2 formalities or 2 aspects of the same thing, such as animality and rationality, or the will and the intellect. Now, one thing that we'll notice here is that a lot of the arguments are going to be against aspect B, where they are distinct prior to the action of the mind. This is what most philosophers have taken issue with, Phaser and Suarez among them. I won't have any of Phaser's arguments in this, simply because he's aping Suarez's arguments. But yeah. Okay, first, a quick argument that the distinction is prior to the action of the mind. Well, first, concepts apply to things either partially or entirely. There's no, or not at all, I guess, but that would be irrelevant to the current discussion. Second, our ideas of certain simple things, such as the human soul, contain multiple concepts. The human soul is one thing, it's simple, it doesn't have parts, but it does have, well, you know, an intellect and a will. Yeah. Third, therefore, they apply to the human soul either partially or entirely. The ideas of intellect and will either apply to the entire soul or to just part of it. If they apply partially, then there must be something which corresponds to the concept in the thing, so that they would be distinct in the thing and not just in the mind. So when you think about the will and the intellect, they're about different things. They're not about, like, the ideas are not identical. So they have to apply to different things in the world. And that would just be them being distinct prior to the action of the mind. And then the next step here, if they both apply entirely, then they must be the same idea because they have the same referent, assuming we aren't talking about relational distinctions. So again, if the will and the intellect both apply in their entirety to the human soul, then the human soul is nothing other than a will and an intellect, but it isn't just a will and an intellect. Those have different meanings, they have different definitions, so they have to apply in part to different things. So they aren't ideas, so it can't be entirely, which means they must be distinct prior to the action of the mind. This argument is a little complicated. It might help if you pause the video and read it through a couple times. Okay, Suarez's first argument against the formal distinction. 1. Entities are either real or mental. This disjunct is coextensive with all distinctions possible. 2. If any distinction falls outside the category of all possible distinctions, it is ill-defined. Therefore, any distinction which claims to be neither real nor mental is ill-defined. 4. The formal distinction claims to be neither real nor mental. 5. Therefore, the formal distinction is ill-defined. The response to this is simply that if real means distinct prior to the action of the mind, then it is a real distinction. If real means a distinction of composition, then it's not a real distinction. It's as simple as that. Depending on how you define real, it will fall into one category or the other, but it's not some sort of weird halfway. Next, Suarez's second argument against. Beings are either diverse or they are identical. There can be no third category. The formal distinction claims a third category, therefore there can be no formal distinction. The answer to this is just that they're diverse in one way and identical in another. They belong to the same thing, but they have different definitions and they're different aspects of that same thing. Simple as. Suarez's third argument against. If formalities are really distinct, then they multiply the number of beings in a substance. If the formal distinction exists, then it posits really distinct formalities. Therefore, the formal distinction posits multiple separate beings in a substance. The unity under a common aspect, so when they have just one thing in common, is not unity, but a likeness observed by the mind. Therefore, if the formal distinction exists, substances are not unified, but substances are unified, therefore the formal distinction is fake or false. The answer to this is just to deny premise 1. Just because you accept a formal distinction does not mean you accept that there are multiple full beings in a substance as a result of their being distinct prior to the action of the mind. This just is flatly denied, and there really isn't any support given in Suarez or anywhere else to think that just because they're distinct prior to the action of the mind, it must be a distinction of composition. And then the final objection is one adapted from St. Bernard. If God's wisdom is formally distinct with God, then it must either be greater than, less than, or equal to the divine essence. But it is impossible for anything to be greater than the divine essence, therefore it cannot be greater than the divine essence. If it was less than the divine essence, then it would be a creature, but God cannot have knowledge through a creature. Therefore it cannot be less than the divine essence. If it were equal to the divine essence, but really distinct, then we would have two gods. But there is only one God, so it cannot be equal to the divine essence. And then by modus tollens, therefore, God's wisdom cannot be formally distinct from God. The answer to this is to deny premise 7. They are not multiple different things, but different aspects of the same thing. Therefore, they can have equality without being two different full gods. Yeah. And that's going to be the entire video on unity and distinction. I hope you learned something. And let me know if you want me to make more original videos on subjects like this. Yeah. Have a nice day.